Greetings, Daniel. We're about to record, I hope, three sessions, back to back, three parts, exploring the history of how we arrived with what we call the sanctuary doctrine. As we start talking about the sanctuary, there's been a whole long 180 plus years of discovering things, and I would start with William Miller. William Miller arrested attention of many with preaching on Daniel chapter 8, verse 13. Unto 2,300 days, then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. And we're not getting off subject exploring if these are 2,300 days or 2,300 morning and evening sacrifices. We'll go there later on when we deal with the daily itself. Today, I just want to unpack the history. Now, to unpack the history, I have to go way back to John Owen, Vice Chancellor of Oxford University. He was a nonconformist Puritan, and he pointed out that heaven itself is Christ's sanctuary. He pointed Christian focus on sanctuary in heaven. Prior to this, as we talked before, the sanctuary attention was not in heaven. It was temples on earth that were in focus. And so when I open Leroy Froome's prophetic faith of our fathers, there's a whole table, and of course you can see on the screen, so I'm going to kind of zoom in, where he lists number of theologians of German, Irish, English, American background who were studying this 2,300-day prophecy. And they were concluding that it should be fulfilled variety of dates: 1819, 1847, 1762, 1966. You see, all over the place, they're grappling with that. They're trying to understand. And so there are a lot of advocates of this 2,300-year prophecy. I'm emphasizing this because there's some people say, well, nobody else paid attention, William Miller, and then you're trying to justify. No, there are a lot. If you do historical research, a lot of them. Among these, there's an interesting person by name Joseph Wolf. Joseph Wolf was a son of a Jewish rabbi who, in Germany, converted to Christianity. He actually traveled to Rome, met the Pope personally. Just imagine the significance of that, because there's such a novelty, a son of Jewish rabbi becoming Christian. But he was disappointed in newly found Christianity and Catholicism. So he moved to England, and he joined the movement of Edward Irving, who was teaching prophecy and soon coming of Christ. And so he ended up traveling the world in those days. And when he would eventually return, he would visit United States and publish his book, Missionary Labors. He was of such significance that former President John Quincy Adams invited him to speak to United States Congress. He believed that the second coming of Christ should happen in 1847. I'm skipping here Manuel Lacunza, Jesuit from South America, because he impacted many reformers too. But my point is, William Miller was not alone. His journey may be unique, but he was not alone. I think it's worth to look at him as a person, to understand his background, why he did not come with a ready doctrine, why his journey began to grow in stages. William Miller was not a theologian. He grew up in a family of a military man, but as he got married at the age of 21, he started farming. That was typical of North American folks. Eventually, as he grew a bit older, at 27, he became policeman, then became militia lieutenant, and during the War of 1812, he served in the army. Now, a few things happened, and we don't have time to get into it, that made him question maybe there is a God. Because, see, he was a deist. He believed in God, but deists don't believe that God is involved with us, right?
As you began with Daniel 8:14, as with any good Adventist should know, our understanding of the sanctuary doctrine technically started from a misunderstanding of the sanctuary, and that's what we're exploring now. Is that this regular man from the New England on the border of Vermont and New York just was studying his Bible when he came across this passage, and he
Right.
tied
Right.
into what whole others of generations before him was were studying.
But he was not aware of that. He was not aware of all these explorations. Okay. And I know it sounds like a narrative, but it's important to understand where it all started.
The
Right.
reason why this is very important, that is because I find in pastoring that even Adventists don't know about William Miller. Because if I were to ask Adventists who is the founder of the Advent movement, they're very likely to say Ellen G. White or James White. Most of them forget it actually began with a man who never became a Seventh day Adventist. It began with William Miller.
When he came home from war, he started studying his Bible. First, maybe to prove his wife and his friends that this whole superstition is a nonsense. But as he read the Bible, he was fascinated with prophecies, with timelines. And so in 1818, he discovered that passage of Daniel 8:14. And he would study that passage for 4 years, coming to conclusion that according to that passage, Christ must be coming in 1843. He became convinced of it. He written in his journal, I believe that the second coming of Jesus Christ is near, even at the door, in 21 years, in 1843 or before. Now, he had to figure out what does it mean sanctuary to be cleansed. And so he literally would write from the Bible what the sanctuary is. And for those of you who listened to our previous lectures, you already got the ideas that sanctuary is a very broad idea. From Moses' tabernacle to Solomon's temple to the post-exilic second temple, idol sanctuaries are also sanctuaries, right? And
Mhm.
so God Himself is a sanctuary. God Himself is a temple. And so He looked at all these options, and then by exclusion, He says, well, cannot be Moses' tabernacle because it hasn't been around for what, 3,000 years. Cannot be Solomon's temple. It's been destroyed for what, 2,500 years, right? So He started excluding some. And so He narrowed down to a smaller selection. And then He concluded that the earth is where the sanctuary shall be cleansed, because he just could not get the idea that somehow there could be pollution in heaven.
To add how he narrowed it down, William Miller technically had multiple reaffirming timelines. We still speak of the 2300 days, but he also believed in the 2520. He narrowed it down by adding more timelines until it's centralized around 1843.
Let's look at this. This is how he arrived at this passage, at the dating itself. That's how others consider this date. And I'm opening my Bible to Ezra um, chapter 6. By the way, I'm not recording in my usual space. That's why I'm using the virtual screen today. But when you look at the book of Ezra 6:14, it's the singular commandment of God, according to the commandment of God of Israel, and according to the command singular. And then three different kings mentioned: Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And what's unique to me, it's one decree, but there are three different kings. Now, when you go to the next chapter of Ezra, you come to Ezra 7, and specific date is given. Verse 8, Ezra came to Jerusalem in the fifth month, which was in the seventh year of the king. And so you have the idea of date here. It's 457 before Common Era. There's a more details given from verse 13. I issue a decree that all those of the people of Israel and the priests and Levites in my realm who volunteer to go up to Jerusalem may go with you. And so Ezra goes to complete um, a specific prophecy of restoration of Jerusalem. And so they would begin to count the 2300 from that year, and they would arrive at that date. And so William Miller would write that Christ will come, cleanse, purify again to this earth. See his emphasis on this earth, and take possession of the same with all the saints, sometimes between March 21st, 1843, and March 21st, 1844. And so he did not set any specific date. He stretched it for the whole year. And I find it interesting how it goes from March 21st to March 21st. He knew the Jewish calendar began around the Passover, but he would not even use Jewish dating for Passover. March 21st, the first day of the spring. And so he just giving a whole year. Now notice he would not preach this for 9 more years. He hesitated preaching it until he was invited, and that's whole another story, to preach his first public sermon at that Baptist church in Dresden, New York. And from there on, he would go on preaching. And he preached 800 sermons within that span of about 8 years. Now, that's a lot. If
Mhm.
you figure out 52 weekends, that's 100 sermons per year. That's 2 sermons each weekend.
Mhm.
That's a lot of sermons. And his preaching was the same: sanctuary will be cleansed, Christ is coming. And then he meets this guy, Joshua Vihimes, pastor himself from Boston. And when he heard Miller preach, he said to him that you need to take this wider. And he became his publicist. Long story short, they got a tent, they start traveling, they start gathering other preachers who joined the movement, and pretty soon this was a movement.
Mhm.
Many others join in who contributed. You mentioned different dates. This is just an example of one of those charts designed by Charles Fitch and Apollos Hale. And yes, there is a Daniel 2, Daniel 7, and the trumpets from Revelation and their understanding of what those trumpets meant and whatnot. And so they were coming up with many supportive dates for that 1844.
Now,
Along came a Methodist professor, Josiah Litch, and he left his employ as a professor, as a teacher, to join the movement. And he was the first to give an idea of pre Advent judgment. His idea was simple: when Jesus comes, he brings his reward with him. That means things are figured out and decided before the second coming. Now, we're going to record another 3 session on the judgment matter itself, so I'm skipping over this, just sharing that it was not just Miller. There are many other contributing preachers in that movement.
but with this, in this movement, it's necessary to say that the sanctuary was tangential for most of the movement because it was a misunderstanding. It's not like they were looking for how do you discern the sanctuary, how do you interpret the sanctuary. It was a date setting movement. The end of the world is nigh. And only after, in retrospect, did we start to understand the sanctuary. So, for example, with
Correct.
Lich and the investigative judgment, there was at this time technically no link between judgment and the sanctuary, something which is now central to our theology. The reason why Lich came to that belief was because we do not believe in the immortal soul. And so, this idea of where the saints go after you die, and simply because of our understanding of what I think evangelicals now call soul sleep, is why Lich came up with this idea, this theory of the fact that you are judged while you live, and Christ comes because he has settled the judgment, not to begin it. And that is probably the biggest distinction that most Christians don't realize, or most Adventists don't realize. We believe we are judged while we live, whereas majority of Christian churches believe judgment is something far in the future that comes at the end of all things, what they may call the great white throne judgment in Revelation. We do believe that. That's called the executive judgment, which comes after the millennium when the second resurrection occurs. But I'm saying all that because even now I've seen Adventists misunderstand their own interpretation of the
Mhm.
sanctuary and the judgment
I appreciate you pointing out that at this time, they don't understand sanctuary.
at all.
To them, it's Christ coming and setting a particular date. So along comes Joseph Bates, and he's the one who starts suggesting we need a concrete date. This whole from the spring of 43 to spring of 44 doesn't cut it. We need a concrete date. He would become president of the movement. He will introduce camp meetings, and this is how it would go viral. Today, hey, it's YouTube that makes it viral. Back then, it would be camp meeting that would take the movement viral. And so they really pushed for date setting. And so when he published those papers, they would put all these illustrations and they would suggest that the world would end in a specific date. When it did not happen, They were already disappointed. But then comes this fellow, Samuel Snow, who suggests a date, October 22, the 10th day of the 7th month. It would become a whole movement. Notice, he suggested that in August. That's literally 2 months before. So that's not some future distant date setting. It's very close date setting.
Now, I want to throw in there because we still get a lot of flack today from critics that say, oh, how could the Advent movement be started in this way? When you put it in context, this is all occurring during the Second Great Awakening of America, where it's not just us, but so many other Christian movements are having this religious zeal and the spirit of camp meetings, as you mentioned. I have a work of art here in my home that just shows Christians truly just losing it in the spirit in the culture of camp meetings. And so it's kind of really hard to imagine the passion, because to think that date that Samuel Snow set spread not just around the area, across the country and across the ocean in less than 2 months. So
Mhm.
the fervor with which they were sharing this news is really just hard to imagine without actually having been there.
Samuel Snow would never become Seventh-day Adventist. After
No,
the great disappointment, he would go on setting dates. He would create his own movement. He would declare himself Elijah the prophet.
yeah.
So he would literally become a cult leader. But he was part of that Millerite, Joshua Viheim's, Litch, and many others movement that expected Jesus to come to cleanse the earth as the sanctuary.
And see, as you mentioned, Dad, most of these men never really joined the movement. In fact, only one of the people you've listed would go on to become a Seventh day Adventist. That's Joseph Bates. The rest of these men would go on to be in the Advent Christian movement, which retained a Sunday keeping movement. And they coexisted with us for several decades.
Mhm.
At this time, it's, I think it's really deserving to recognize that the sanctuary was all tangential, something they weren't really thinking about. All they were thinking about, he is coming soon.
This whole date, October 22, is also spurious. He claims that he got it from the Karaite Jews, and later scholars also suggested within our denomination that yes, it's a Karaite calendar. However, there's no confirmation of that. I find it interesting. It may be coincidence. I don't know. I don't have any proofs and I don't want to speculate. But October 22 was a unique date, 200 plus years before. Bishop Usher, who was an Anglican bishop, thought that he figured out by doing the math, according to King James Bible, that the world was created on October 22nd,
Mhm.
4004 BC. And see, that would be in their Bibles on the margin. And so, wouldn't that be great if Jesus would come on the same day when he created the world 6,000 years later? And so, this became the date that they expected Jesus to come to the earth. They hoped that the earth is the sanctuary. And of course,
It
it
came and
did
went.
not happen on that date. And so that day became great disappointment. So historical thing of October 22, 1844, it became a great disappointment. Caricatures were published by newspapers of Tabernacle going up, but Miller staying behind. And so it was really a sad time, but it gave opportunity for mockers to ridicule the movement.
And see, this is where the ridicule of the movement admittedly was deserving. If we think about it in the context, they were wrong. The problem is most of our critics today stop there. They only stop where the movement stopped, at the Great Disappointment, where we're looking at the development of the sanctuary doctrine because it occurred in the aftermath of the movement.
That's right. That's right.
It was not a failure of the sanctuary that led to the Great Disappointment, but it's because we went back and looked at the scriptures that we discovered the great truth of the sanctuary after such a
Mhm.
terrible disappointment.
Right. It was misunderstanding of what sanctuary is that led to the disappointment and miscalculation. And if you look back at the feast, you would remember that the feast that is pointing out to Jesus' second coming is not Yom Kippur, not the Day of Atonement, but rather the Sukkot. So even there, it shows they did not have clear understanding of sanctuary message.
And the reason why I'm harping on it so much, Dad, is how the early movement treated the sanctuary and disregarded it. Is because the sermon you preached recently. brings to light the fact that Adventists today are still disregarding the sanctuary. And as you just point out, the principle, a misunderstanding of the sanctuary will lead to disappointment because
That's
there
right.
are 6,000 years theories and all other different theories that continue to make the same mistake Miller did of setting
Hmm.
dates,
Hmm.
which was the original problem, was disregarding the true meaning of the sanctuary, and that's what led to disappointment.
In the aftermath of disappointment, a new figure emerges, Hiram Edson. The day after, he's walking to pray with his friends to encourage his friends, and he's the one credited with giving this idea that the sanctuary is not earth, the sanctuary is in heaven. Now, this is how he would later describe his experience. He said, "Heaven seemed open to my view, and I saw distinctly and clearly Christ entering the most holy place." Now, he's been ridiculed for that by critics. And I'm saying, how is that any different than Stephen in the book of Acts, who's being stoned to death, looks up and says, "What? I see Christ
So,
standing at the right hand of the Father." Do you see? Now, did Stephen see vision? Yes, he saw vision. Was that vision prophetic? No. It was comforting to him. And so here's a believer who's confused, walking, and he sees what he claims that heaven seemed open to his view, and he saw distinctly and clearly. And so he would share with his friends that we were wrong. The sanctuary is not here on earth, the sanctuary is in heaven. So he drew their attention to study the Bible to understand this whole sanctuary in heaven business. Now, we traveled there when you were a little boy. Do you remember that?
I remember it.
In 2012, with grandma, with the whole family to Hiram Hudson Farm in New York. And it was really interesting experience kind of to realize that these were simple farmers, simple people who dug deeper into the Bible. And so along him would emerge uh, Owen Russell Loomis Crozier, who himself would eventually leave, but he would develop the teaching about Christ in his sanctuary in heaven. They had another friend, Dr. Franklin Hahn, and I cannot find his picture, only his memorial stone. He was wealthy, and so he helped to finance the publication because they believe that Christ is our high priest in heaven. And so in Daystar in Cincinnati, where you're ministering right now, my birthday, so I would never forget the date, February 7th, not the
Enoch
year though,
Jacobs. Enoch Jacobs was the publisher. Uh,
right, 1846, they published their discovery that Christ is ministering in heavenly sanctuary. And today, no one could deny that. You just read the book of Hebrews, and we'll get there eventually. But this is how the movement began. They start looking at Christ's ministry in heavenly sanctuary. This is what Crozier wrote. Daily service was established for the forgiveness of sins, and the Day of Atonement for erasing sins from heavenly records. So Crozier would begin to teach that this whole cleansing of the sanctuary is about erasing sins from heavenly records. Notice, not Miller, not Bates. It would be Crozier, not even Hiram Edson. He continued farming, but it would be Crozier who would bring this idea that cleansing of the sanctuary has to do with Day of Atonement and erasing sins from heavenly records. What's interesting that Ellen White, who would be at that time only 20 years old, newly married, when she would write her reflections in a little booklet, Word to the Little Flock, she believed that Crozier had the true light on the cleansing of the sanctuary. It was important to her, but she herself did not fully understand the sanctuary. Notice they're not focusing on the whole sanctuary, but what? Cleansing of the sanctuary. That's all. They're still zooming in on that Daniel 8:14. What does it mean for the sanctuary to be cleansed? And they're beginning to speculate as they study the Bible that perhaps it's a erasing of the sins, cleansing the records. They're starting to connect it to the Day of Atonement. Now, you mentioned already the state of the dead, that the
mhm.
reaction to the state of the dead was by Lich. So Prior to the sanctuary, two doctrines that Millerites agreed on were second coming and state of the dead.
Hmm.
Because the reason there is a second coming, because the dead need to be raised. So the
Correct.
very next doctrine that we would discover would be the sanctuary, not the Sabbath. The sanctuary was the next discovery after the great disappointment.
Now,
Sanctuary was our central doctrine after disappointment.
now I want to interject and just go back a little to what Sister White said about what Crozier said, because we also get a lot of criticism today by evangelical Christians who say that Adventist theology denies the atonement Christ won for us at the cross, which is wrong, because as we just noted what Crozier said, it is not a denial, it is a continuation. So we are what? Forgiven, and now the sins on the Day of Atonement are what? Erased. That's not a denial of the fact that we are forgiven. That's not a denial of the fact that we are saved. It is only saying that as the day draws near, when He comes soon and very soon, guess what? Salvation becomes even more intense as He comes soon and very soon. And I
Mm.
enjoy the fact that we live in the anti-typical Day of Atonement.
Another figure that we mentioned was Joseph Bates. And see, Joseph Bates was digging deeper in the book of Revelation, and he discovered that Revelation chapter 10, the experience of eating the book, and it's sweet in their mouth and bitter in their belly. And so he realizes that chapter 10 ends with the words, "You must prophesy again." And so this would become a rallying cry for Joseph Bates. You must prophesy again. And then he looks to the next verse and he sees that there is a measuring rod given, and that measuring rod is to measure the temple. And so now he's connecting this newly discovered sanctuary doctrine that it's the key to prophesying again. Joseph Bates, he sees this as symbolic, measuring the temple. And the reason it is symbolic, because he also sees that in Ezekiel, there's also measuring rod before the restoration of the temple. But Joseph Bates himself gets confused because as he begins to read book of Leviticus to understand this whole Day of Atonement business a bit more, he comes to an interesting verse in chapter 16, and it's
Hmm.
verse 14, where the high priest, is described as taking blood and sprinkling it with his finger on the mercy seat on the east side, sprinkling 7 times. And because they're so driven by this prophetic symbolism, to him, 7 times becomes 7 more years. And he suggests the shut door theory, connecting it with Matthew 25, that the door was shut. And so a new theory is created that we have to wait 7 more years from 1844 to 1851. Now, it sounds bizarre for us, but that's how they struggled to understand it. 7 times gave 7 years, shut door theory. And he was at odds with James White because James White in 1849 would begin to publish because Allen had a vision to start publishing the paper. And Joseph Bates thought that that was a waste of time. We need to go and visit all the former Millerites and told them that 1851, Jesus is coming.
This example you give of Joseph Bates' 7 times 7 years shut door theory, I think it's illustrative of the fact that sanctuary debates have always been a part of Adventist history. From the earliest part of the movement, debates and disagreement over the sanctuary. It's not something new nowadays that people debate. They were debating even from the moment they realized there is a sanctuary
Mhm.
in it.
We do not claim, like Mormons, that there is some kind of golden tablets and we just copied them down. It's a real journey of real people struggling to understand the Bible.
Hmm.
And it was messy.
It still is.
And so it's in that time that they would reprint now those charts. And when you look at the new charts from 1850 version, you would see the sanctuary now. See,
Hmm.
the sanctuary is coming to be studied more. They begin to dig deeper. They want to understand the sanctuary. And so James White would write his version, sanctuary, 2300 days, and shut door. And you understand, he's disputing this whole theory of shut door, and he is grappling with what the cleansing of the sanctuary means to them back in that time. John Andrews, in whose honor our main university is named, he was the early scholar of Adventism. He would write a book on sanctuary and 2300 days. Now, we're not exploring these books. I'm just giving titles to understand that their whole focus on the sanctuary was Daniel 8:14, nothing else. If anything else, it was tangential, trying to understand what is the cleansing of the sanctuary. How are 2300 days being fulfilled? Now, Loughborough writes next year, asking these questions. What was that work of cleansing? Is the work of cleansing the sanctuary fitly heralded by the first angel's message? Is it a work of judgment? Because remember, the first angel says the hour of judgment has come. And so he suggests tentative connection, says it certainly looks us. So this is not definite assertion. It looks to him like the first angel's message, the hour of judgment and cleansing of the sanctuary and day of atonement is connected. So he is suggesting this connection between Revelation 14 and Daniel 8:14. You see that connection?
Hmm.
And so that's how this theology began to emerge. And then, of course, comes Uriah Smith, who would shape the Adventist understanding of Daniel and Revelation. And his booklet is 2300 Days and the Judgment. So
Hmm.
Uriah Smith would begin to build this whole theory of judgment. And that's how the connection to Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement, the Judgment, Day of Judgment emerges. In a review article on October 2nd, which would be anniversary, 11th anniversary of Great Disappointment, he would write, the work of cleansing the earthly sanctuary was a work of judgment. And now he's connecting Leviticus 16 with Daniel 7, which is the vision of thrones are set in judgment in Daniel 7. So notice they start with Daniel 8, they go to Revelation, they go to Leviticus, and now they begin to connect different chapters of the Bible. Now his monumental work, the year when our church was created, 1863, was titled The Sanctuary and the 2300 Days of Daniel 8:14. I used the script that they used, the Roman numerals for chapters, just to emphasize the significance of what? Daniel 8:14. That's where it all began for us as Seventh-day Adventists. Now notice how Ellen White grew in her understanding. Back in 1847, when she was affirming Crozier having the true light, she had a vision. And as she describes that vision, she says, I saw on a mount a glorious temple. And then years go by, they study the sanctuary, they begin to understand the symbolism of the temple, and she realized what she saw was not a temple. And so she rewrites it, saying, on a mount was a building which looked to me like a temple. And so for this, she's again being criticized. So that she's a temple. Well, there's a difference. And I hope we allow a person to grow. What you understand when you're 17 years old or 20 years old is a beginning of your spiritual journey. And I hope by the time you turn 40, that you would see things a bit different. And so she herself grew and revised her own understandings as their understanding of what sanctuary is would grow. When we started publishing around this time, the first logo that would be
What?
published in our papers,
The Ark of the Covenant.
the Ark of the Covenant, you see. The
Yeah.
sanctuary was so prominent that our original logo would be the Ark of the Covenant, the Ark of the Testament. Later on, it would be revised, cross would be added, and the crown, because we're expecting kingdom of Christ, and Christ has completed the atonement on the cross. But then the center is still what? The Ark of his Testament.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, we got so busy with organization and health and mission and figuring out what is our relationship to the law versus faith that the sanctuary was put on the back burner. The next few decades would be talking about many other things but the sanctuary.
You know, that this is to me a major sticking point. To me, these seem like common sense because I've heard you preach and teach the sanctuary all my life, literally. And to me, it makes sense. But I realize many Adventists, they don't or are unaware about this aspect of our history. They think we came into existence already perfect, as if we had it all figured out and we knew what the sanctuary was, and the idea of investigative judgment had been mapped out. But it was decades of gradual development, difficulty, and at a point, it was actually put on the back burner while more pressing issues of organization and institution building came to the forefront. And we would only come back to the sanctuary debates, really, I'd say, what, the 1930s? When would you say it came back as with Ballinger and all of them having these great debates?
Well, that's for the next lecture. We're going
That's
to stop right here. All right.